I'm really looking forward to this because I have just finished a game.
All right. Well, um, I guess there's nobody in chat, but hello everybody. Um, this is sort of an experimental panel where I just wanted to bring together a bunch of nerds to talk about magic in tabletop RPGs, books, movies, and video games, and see if we can't, like, essentially the idea is to rub together enough nerds to just spark some sort of ideas, what we think could be done to make any or all of those things better, and more enjoyable. So, if you guys want to introduce yourselves in whatever capacity, that'd be great. If not, that's on you.
I'm Seventh Outpost, or James.
Jason. I don't have any monikers or nicknames, so hi.
I'm Panda, or your Unicorn Explosions.
And I'm Vylentine, aka Vi or Vile. I also am a streamer on here, so sometimes.
Yeah, so essentially the idea kind of came to me when I was arguing with Whick here. Jason, what was it, a week or two ago?
It was a couple weeks ago. We were actually watching other people argue about something entirely disconnected, and we had quite the lively discussion on two different tabletop role-playing game systems and how they dealt with magic in each. And I thought it was an interesting discussion. We totally disagreed on what our preferred methods were, but it kind of branched out into a whole lot of other things. It was fun.
Yeah, and actually the reason you got pulled in, Vylentine, is because I've seen you have a similar discussion with people about D&D and Vampire and Mage and so on Twitter.
Yeah, that sounds like me.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's a lot of fun. And so because we're going to be doing more of a loose thing, sort of as an initial thing, topic, idea, whatever, you'll often hear it say in tabletop role-playing game circles, though I'm not so sure if it's said in game player circles, but that there are a lot of things that tabletop RPGs can do that video games are strictly incapable of. Recently, though, I've been playing through games like Minecraft's Thaumcraft mod, and I've been playing Cultist Simulator, and I'm not actually convinced on this anymore. I'm not sure that there are that many things that tabletop games can do that video games are incapable of.
The biggest draw to me for tabletop role-playing games, as opposed to video games, is that in tabletop role-playing games, you do not have the technical limitations that you do in a video game. You are free to create things out of whole cloth instantly, whereas in a video game, you would be limited by the engine they're using and the technology they're using.
There's definitely limitations on tabletop systems too. Like, by virtue of having a rule set, you're going to always have limitations on what you could do. But yeah, you can add stuff in as like a player or as like a separate DM that they didn't necessarily intend. Also, I love Cultist Simulator.
It's fantastic. That's the next video I'm working on. It's great.
I've been playing like Fault in London for forever, so like I was already a big fan of Alexis Kennedy.
It is a great game. I would say what sets tabletops apart from PC games is mainly the fact that you can, how should I say it? You have a living person to fill in the gaps, and in systems like D&D, you don't see that, because D&D is a system that works on PC. Like, you can totally port 5e and make a game out of it. That is absolutely the case. But that's how D&D works. Now, you have other systems that allow you for more freeform magic that would be just utterly impossible in any like regular RPG, because let's say you have, for example, some kind of shaping metal skill, right? Or magic in an RPG, and you decide that, like, okay, I make a sword out of that, or I make a shield out of that, or I try to improve on the design of the shield that I already have. It would, like, unless the designer of the game expected you to try to do something like this, you just can't do it. You just don't have the freeform ability to do whatever you want, to shape metal into whatever you want. You know, I've had players, I've genuinely had players do something like shape, in the middle of a game, shape earth into a furnace, and then use the furnace to melt scrap to make themselves armor and weaponry and such, because they were missing something, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like you just can't do that in a regular game, with some exceptions, I guess. Maybe Dwarf Fortress. But
I think another kind of like counterpoint to that, though, is that I find magic systems and combat systems overall in video games tend to be a lot less clunky and a lot like faster and feel more natural than in TTRPGs. That's actually one of my biggest complaints about D&D is combat takes so long. It doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel fun to me, at least.
Testing
a lot
out
of times,
experimental
it's just
panel
such a freaking slog
format
to get one attack
where
in,
we are sort of discussing.
I think there are ways that
where we're discussing magic in video games and tabletop RPGs to see if we can't generate some ideas to improve either or both of them.
Game, I prefer them because if a system sucks, I can fix it. I can make it work for the players at my table, and I could do it like that, or not like that, but you know.
I apologize if you can't hear me as well.
Enough, I know why it's not working and what can be made to make it work. For
I mean,
example,
it's definitely magic
so long
systems.
in things like Dungeons and Dragons. Easy fix that I've found, at least in most systems that use the D20, is just to have a timer and to kind of set the tone at the table that don't be on your phone, don't be talking to your friends. When it's time for your turn, you better be ready, because if you don't take your turn in a minute, you lose it.
Well, I'd actually like to address something that Seventh Outpost said, because he actually posed a scenario that I've been in exactly recently in Minecraft. That whole forging shaping a forge out of stone and making armor mid-combat is literally a thing I did on stream. It's part of why Minecraft and Cultist Simulator and similar games are why I started questioning, is it actually impossible? Because we have developed technology and programming to the point where we can accomplish actually relatively complicated things to create emergent systems, emergent gameplay, where developers don't necessarily intend a thing to happen. In Minecraft, they didn't intend a flying machine, and yet if you look at Minecraft flying machines, they exist, and they're awful.
I wouldn't call them awful, but
I mean, have you seen the one?
That's partly. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, have you seen the one that's the sticky pistons just pulling one another back and forth? They're terrible sounding.
I think part of the reason we think of video game magic systems being so limited is partly in what the point of a video game is. Not all video games have the same point, which is why you have stuff like Minecraft or like games that have like heavily encouraged modding where people just go hog wild. It just really depends on what the developer had in mind, and that goes for TTRPGs as well.
Mm-hmm.
If the developer wants to encourage that kind of creativity and wants to make it available in both video games and TTRPGs, it'll be easier. If they're not, if they want it more closed, if they don't want people adding on to it, they can find ways to make that harder.
I guess for me, it's just in the video game, I'm not a programmer. I can't work with the developer, make a mod to suit my needs. In a tabletop RPG, I can, in a sense, work with the developer and make it easier to be creative with. And this works in almost any system.
Yeah, you can even move outside of the developer's intention.
Yes, because.
But if you wanted to learn how to program, you could do that with a video game too. Is kind of my point, or some of them, like not all.
Could, but the time, there's just.
It takes time to learn the TTRPG system that well too, though. It's kind of my point.
No,
especially if you want to make a good secondary system to throw on there, because I've seen, and this is the discussion Whick and I actually got into in that other discussion. Was Whick was talking about essentially creating the Mage magic system inside of the D&D magic system, and it's from a book by Green Ronin, I believe it was, who made the Chaos Mage, and it's awful.
And again, to just explain my point, that during the discussion you mentioned that you preferred the Mage system because it encouraged narrative in the spellcasting, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
And my point was that the D&D system, while not encouraging it, does not restrict it. If you wish to have the narrative portion in the D&D system, you very much can. You can use narrative to enhance your spells, and as a dungeon master, you can encourage that behavior at the table. No, the system doesn't mention it, but you at the table definitely can encourage it.
Yeah,
I feel like because the first system doesn't encourage it, though, it often doesn't happen. At least, okay, and
no,
I want to preface this with I've
doesn't.
had a lot of bad experiences at D&D tables. I literally just joined a D&D table specifically because I finally found one freaking DM who would let me make an alchemist that makes slimes instead of like potions and elixirs, and it's literally just a flavor thing. And I couldn't find anybody to let me do it.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Like, is that not a joke?
No, it's not a joke.
That sounds absolutely terrible.
Yeah, which is kind of my point. Like, it really just depends on your table.
Hey there, Bobbert. How you doing?
How much they're gonna let you do it, how much they're willing to bend for you, how much they're willing to kind of work with you or make those systems. Because some DMs are just ass.
Well, that's not a system problem. More
actually,
than any,
I would argue that it
is your table. Like,
I think
if your table sucks, no system can save it.
I think I could argue that that it is to a degree a systems problem, because if there is a systemic answer, then if there's a systemic inclusion of this thing, then regardless of what the table imagines already, you can do it within the mechanics.
Because I'm following you, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're getting.
This is a thing. I'm sorry to keep calling back on the previous conversation, but I mean, Unicorn here has been at the table with me. I tend to be an uncreative player. However, as Unicorn might be able to attest to, within a series of systems, I can be creative and manipulative, both as a player and a storyteller. Within the confines of a system, I can come up with all sorts of interesting stories and unique mechanics and mechanical interactions. So traps and so on are not really a thing I would ever create unless it was within a system.
So you would need that guidance there, is what you're saying. That structure. And because the structure is there, you can play within that structure.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And I mean, there was someone else in that conversation who, like, got really annoyed with me for saying that World of Darkness doesn't have any monsters in it. That's because... And that's because none of the books have more than like 2 monsters apiece, and I'm not creative. I can't really think of like how to come up with these monsters and so on.
Bless you.
I'm just sitting here thinking, I remember a lot of monsters in the Mage books.
Yeah, there's like 10 monster entries per book or something at most, or like 6.
I remember there's actually specifically this paradox monster that's called TikTok that lives in your head if you've been screwing with time too much.
Is it called
and it
TikTok
literally
for real?
tick, 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 tick
For-
in your head.
For a second there, I was gonna be like, does it play obnoxious dance videos for you?
No, it just ticks in your head constantly.
With a
like
name
you
like
can't
that,
get rid of it.
It would. It would. That's how I would phrase it.
Cool.
Yeah, a lot of the monsters and adversaries of World of Darkness are in separate books.
Yeah,
as well.
there is like, I think, a monster manual. It might
Kind
be
of like
called
a-
adversaries. A lot of these
but
monsters.
coming quickly back to
Like for Mage, there's...
I guess
Yeah,
systems.
yeah.
I would say that yes, system that you run games in generally facilitates a culture of play. Like, I
Yes.
wouldn't bring my culture of play that I actually like to run to like usual 5e community because they just they wouldn't enjoy it, and I wouldn't enjoy playing like running D&D. You know, I it's just there is a very vast difference in what I want and what my players would want in that situation.
Yeah, how do you guys feel about systems that are a little more open about what kind of spells you can use, like Mage, where you basically make up the spell, versus systems that are more like D&D that have like hard and fast, these are the spell lists, these are the spells you can do. You can add stuff in, obviously, as far as homework, but like base system, here's your list, this is what you do.
I love the Build-A-Bear spell shop. It's my favorite approach to Magic because it allows the players to really like to emergently create what they're going to do. And I've seen it happen in video games a bit, not quite as successfully, but I utterly hate D&D's point and click spell system.
It's only point and click if the DM is brain dead, to be honest with you.
Listen, if you
which is the whole.
Again, I'm just going with the base
straight up,
system. I'm not
like,
talking about modding. I'm not talking about homebrewing. I'm not talking about
Yeah.
building anything that wasn't already built
core
into
D&D, 5e, or
'Cause-
most other editions, it is pretty brain dead. Like that's crap.
Again, I don't like the I don't want to cede the moral ground here that because if you take the dungeon master out of the system, then yeah, it's just a string. It's just laying there. But if you add the DM, it's like a kite, and you got that tension between the rules and the system and the GM, and it can fly. So removing the DM from the spell casting scenario where we just talk about the system is a little too white room for me.
Well,
It's a
no,
little
no,
too
I'm not talking
unrealistic.
about not including the DM. I'm specifically talking about not taking anything that's like homebrewed or not already on like the
You
spell
don't
list.
even like you don't for example, if you it's been a while since
I
I
think
played
the
5th
DM
edition.
could allow. I think the DM could like allow like interesting combinations of
Yes.
spells that are already in there that might do something new, which is part of the system. That's I'm including that as part
Okay.
of the system
Yeah.
that's already baked in. I'm specifically talking about like systems that explicitly let the players build their own spells, like Mage, or kind of Fate. It's a little weird there. Versus systems that come with explicit spell lists that tell you what the spells do, but you can combine them theoretically and do really cool stuff as well.
Well, I prefer the Build-A-Bear, like he was saying. I like that approach. As a player, as a DM, I don't like it so much. But as a
Monty
player,
Cook's World of Darkness is a good example of defined
So,
magic.
I guess the way I run things, I don't like
I heard Monty Cook did okay.
building
Because you're
magic
talking about the
from-
D20
from
World of Darkness,
zero
right?
for my players, because when I run a game, I run it in a very specific
Yeah,
world,
I heard
and
that he
because
did
of that,
pretty
I want
okay.
to understand, where
I
the
never
magic
got to
comes
play it.
from, what kind of
Okay.
what power does it draw on? Because
But
if
I would
it
be
draws
interested
from
in
a
seeing
certain
what he
source of
what he did
power,
for it.
then what if that source withers? What if it's blocked somehow?
And how does that
etc.,
source
etc.?
limit what you can actually do with it? Like,
Exactly.
God, you probably couldn't cast a good spell, just as like a wild example out there.
Everything I want in my system has to be rooted in my world somehow, because that's, I'm running a diceless game, so I need to understand everything that goes on in my world.
Yeah.
So I generally don't allow my players to make things, but I instead try to ask them what they're looking for, and try to offer them solutions within the world. And then very often I would say that like my magic is relatively freeform, but it's like freeform within the world, right?
Right.
Yeah, I was. You were the one who sent me like
Yeah.
the little tidbits of like artifacts and stuff you'd written up, and I was actually just thinking like that's a much better way to do it, because you have to have some level of constraints. Part of what made the chaos
Spell stuff, yeah, there's always rules that go with it. Like for Mage, you have to have the spheres, and the spheres do very specific things.
Yeah, and like I think it was the Chaos Mage from that D&D 3.5 whatever that like had me very much so questioning freeform magic systems, because they could accomplish, I think, practically anything. There were like a handful of restrictions, but then there was like one bit where it was like, and this is the catch-all for everything else.
I think my least favorite thing about Dungeons and Dragons style magic systems is I hate Vatican magic. I hate Vatican systems, where you get spell slots.
Vancian? Is
Oh,
that
I might
right?
be pronouncing it wrong. I'm
Okay,
terrible.
it's Vancian, I think.
Okay, Vancian. Yeah, I don't like that. I don't like the spell slot system. Something about it just rubs me wrong. Having to prepare the spell list prior to actually going into combat things, and only having so many spells a day. The resource limitations. I don't like it.
I don't know about like specifically Vatican, because like I don't like D&D, so I avoid it a lot. But just because you have spell slots doesn't necessarily mean you need to prepare exactly.
Oh, in D&D you
like,
do. Yeah.
And like my alchemist, which I know is a Pathfinder thing, I think, instead of actually D&D, but like it's Pathfinder. Like, come on, it's basically D&D.
It's D&D 3.75.
Right. And I'm currently actually running my alchemist in a mix of 3.5 and 3.75, so it's like 3.6. Because it's a mix of 3.5 and Pathfinder in one game. Like my alchemist, I can prepare stuff. Like I can make potions instead of elixirs, but my elixirs, while I have a certain amount of elixirs per day, I have spell slots. I make them on the fly. I like decide on the fly what to do as I'm doing in combat. So it's definitely more of like a class specific thing, because you can definitely still have like spell
really
slots, but like nothing that has to be prepared ahead of time as well. But you can only like say you only have like so much mana per day, so you have to like fit within the constraints of what you have, but you still get to pick and choose from your whole spell list.
The per day thing is where I kind of dislike it, because it encourages an unnatural adventuring day.
Yeah.
The 5 minutes of action.
Narcolepsy, the narcolepsy warlock.
Yes.
How limited the spell slots are, but I do think that you kind of have to constrain how much magic you can cast, because I mean that energy.
Have you played Shadowrun?
Huh?
Have you played Shadowrun?
I have it, but I haven't been able to find a group yet.
I want to play it so badly.
Literally, I have like 20 freaking systems I want to play, and I can't find anybody to play because everybody plays D&D.
Hey, Whick, you want to run some Shadowrun?
Shadowrun. Let me tell you about Shadowrun's magic system, because I think it does it really well. It has a dice pool. First of all, it's D6s, and you have as a. I'm not going to go into the really. I'm going to make it as simple as possible here. You have
not easy with Shadowrun.
Say one more time.
Not easy with Shadowrun.
Exactly. It's a complex system. But basically, you have a dice pool of magic, and this is a magic power you can have. and you can cast spells all day, but every time you cast a spell, you have to roll to the more powerful the spell is, the more successes you have to get to keep yourself from exploding. So the limitation isn't on time, it's a risk reward thing. I can cast a super powerful world altering spell, but if I do, my head's going to explode, you know what I mean? So you have to take that into account, and I think that is a better way than to limit the power.
I certainly don't think D&D does it the best. I was just arguing a little bit for it.
You do have to limit power. You do have to limit power, but that's in any kind of system. And I like Shadowruns because it puts that limitation in the player's hands. The player gets to decide how much risk they take.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
That's one of the things I liked about Mage, is like you can accidentally tear the world apart if you're casting spells irresponsibly.
Yeah, the paradox will get you.
So I have, I guess I took some ideas from Vance with regards to spells. Spells, I think I think it's like Shattered Earth. I think it was like Jack Vance Shattered Earth that.
The book? Yeah.
Yes, there you go. I think that the spells were like alien intelligences, if I'm correct. Yeah. Well, that's what I took, but like haven't read the book, so I just took ideas from Lovecraft. So basically, my spells are basically alien parasites that you let into your brain by reading a spell book, and it's there, and it's occupying space that should be left for your mental processes take over. Now you can also release it, and the problem is that you don't, unless you release it, you don't know what you're doing, what it's going to do, and many spells are likely to hurt you just as badly as they can hurt your enemies.
Out of curiosity, so did the players don't know what it's going to do before they do it?
Ooh, okay. That's no good.
How should I say it? That depends on the spell. If they start with a spell, then as a wizard who does these kinds of things, then they can know, because it's like, well, you probably bred that and released it at some point. Okay, you probably know what it does. But the thing is, if they find in some dark ruin of the ancient kind who was very rightfully destroyed by a flood by the gods, like they find that and they're like, yeah, that's a very good idea. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna get it into our heads. Then they're kind of asking for it in a way. So, but they can be very strange and they can interact with those effects, etc., etc.
All right. Hey, Darth, you there?
Certainly am.
Awesome. Just wanted to make sure that we could all hear you and everything.
Yeah, I just wanted to get. Are we just listening to sort of spell types and spells at the moment, or the entire mechanics?
We're kind of just discussing magic and TTRPGs and video games in general, as well as often kind of going off into our own arguments about what systems should and shouldn't do.
Yeah, we're
amazing, because I was just listening to the description, the mechanics. I'm focusing on my role in this discussion with you lot from a mechanical kind of point of view. I do designing of computer games. So with your particular one that you're describing, who are you? Your 7th Outpost, are you?
James. You can call me James if you will.
Okay, James. So you were discussing your one, nanites, go into the brain, or whatever, the virus, I'm sorry if I missed that. And that's almost the entirety of the mechanic. It can be summed up in a sentence almost. And then you, as your game master, if you're role-playing it or in the game, you've got a lot of narrative sort of power. So is that what we're talking about? We're talking about different systems and how the narratives go into different games and tabletop RPGs and so on like that. So this is one you made, I'm guessing. So you said you had lots of them.
Sort of what we said, that's what we're doing, is we're just sort of talking about the mechanics of things, talking about the narrative aspects of magic and so on.
How the mechanics influence the narrative and vice versa.
And also I am over time trying to make the case that the old adage that there's too much that tabletop role-playing games can do, that video games can't, that gap has been narrowed significantly.
I think the gap has actually super been narrowed, just because video game, like indie developers have kind of pushed into that space a lot more and made it a lot more flexible, or like I feel like indie devs are really pushing for that kind of closure between the two more than like the AAA who like do the safe thing, do the same stuff they've always done because we want to make a profit,
and not
rather
just
than necessarily have a very specific vision.
And not just indie devs, but mod developers for video games are like where a lot of my focus ends up, because it's a thing I plan on talking about more as my channel develops. But mod developers are really like, because there's a whole world already built for them, they have so much less stress when it comes to designing these really insanely intricate systems.
In your stint, Nobodies, as well, you play a lot of Rim of Magic on Rimworld, and that's a game with a mod, just like you were talking about. But it's also a role-playing almost game, so it's actually got the narrative, the emergent narrative coming up because your person casts a spell rather than you just clicking it. Everyone who's watching is in their own head also making up the role-playing element of it. So computer games, as much as they are coming closer, especially with indies leading the charge, thanks for that, Vylentine, I agree. As much as they're getting closer, we're still missing a target, a sort of a bit from tabletop to video games. There's going to be no perfect way until we start getting into sort of virtual reality.
I think part of like the problem you run into with like modding video games to have different stuff versus homebrewing a D&D thing is if there is something that doesn't quite work with the code of the video game, it can break a whole lot more. Whereas a tabletop RPG can be a little bit broken and it won't seriously affect playing the game. You can have that little bit of fakeness without breaking apart the whole system. You know.
Also, again, on a tabletop role-playing game, by and large, this is not always the case, but by and large, it's a cooperative experience. Whereas a video game is naturally an antagonistic experience. You're playing against the game.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's gonna change how people interact with the game, and that because of that antagonistic relationship, the rules need to be a lot more ironclad. It needs to be a lot more inflexible in a lot of ways. So yes, I think the gap has been closed, but not nearly as much as it would require me to think of the two as interchangeable.
I think
absolutely.
If a video game sets out with having that flexibility in mind as far as a magic system goes, it can be basically indistinguishable from the flexibility of a TTRPG, but it's got to be baked into the game. It's got to be something the game intends to do and nails really, really well. If it's not something the game intended, it's just going to be a lot more of a delicate process to add anything into it because of how breakable code is.
Well, I think that so Apnea was talking about one of the mods that I recently did a fairly extensive series on over on YouTube called Rimworld of Magic. The magic system in it is actually not very amazing. It's very point and click, but this whole thing, because it was wrapped into Rimworld, which has the psychology system in it, and because it involved that psychology system, it created a much greater emergent role-playing narrative, whatever. It's part of why I think that, like, sure, you're not gonna get the experience of sitting down and playing D&D with your friends, but it's somewhat close to bridging a gap. That we previously thought impossible in video games.
A PC game only has the system, essentially, and a tabletop has the system and the GM. It really, like, depending on how competent your GM is, you can really branch out almost infinitely, almost on the fly. With a game, there's only so much you can do, and sure, you can mod a lot of things in, but point is that if it's not programmed, and programming takes time, adding assets takes resources, it takes time and money. With tabletops, making a new system would take me like 2 hours or so, right? If I had all the resources, or just like making adjustments mid game would take me like a minute or so to figure out, what does this crazy new thing that my player has come up with.
Right, but
how
that's
do I
also
interact?
because video games are a lot more involved. They have the visual aspect, they have the audio aspect, they have the I want to say interactive aspect, but it's a different interactive aspect from like how TTRPGs are interactive. And so the reason it takes more time and more resources is specifically because you have to interact with all of those and not break any of them. Versus if you're just talking about a tabletop, it could be as simple as an exchange of like verbal words. I don't necessarily think it's
So
it's
I think there's
harder, but mostly because I think it's a different skill set.
I think
it's not
it's-
just your imagination. It's still possible though.
See, the thing
Modding
is,
is
I think
a
it's a
skill,
bit
and now they're both coming up-
disanalogous, even, because it's you're talking about changing things at the table on the fly, but when you're talking about changing things in a video game, you're not changing things on the table or you're not changing things at the table on the fly. You'd be changing. It's more analogous to like putting out a supplement or when you're talking about mod development.
It's reactive. It's more reactive, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely agree, though you can do the broken code thing that I often end up doing with video games where, like, I'll run a lot of mods that have been prepared that are not meant to be run together, and hey, now there's this third thing happening, and why the hell is this happening? And I don't know how many of y'all play how many video games where modding's a thing.
Adding things on the fly to TTRPGs can also break things.
Yeah.
Just because there's no
Funny games.
computer behind it being like keeping track of it all, it doesn't interrupt the experience by necessity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
It's not like it's. I mean, you like Mr. Nobody said, you can't just throw things into the computer game and hope it all works out. It's just the bugs, the breaks, the parts where code's slipping over each other in weird ways is a lot more noticeable because the system, which is keeping track of everything, is perfect. It has perfect recall, and therefore will do it no matter what. Whereas a DM can just be like, sure, technically, I guess that should break that, but we're just going to ignore that it breaks that. We're going to pretend it doesn't break that. We're just going to treat that as normal.
The programs don't have the ability to make actual decisions, whereas people
there's
do.
my point. I was about to make a point about that. Sorry, Whick. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
You
Go ahead.
first, and I'll- So, if anyone's ever looked at neural nets and something called AI Dungeon,
Yeah,
Hmm.
I have.
I think I've heard of it. It's tickling in the back of my brain.
so it's not perfect. There's nowhere near perfect. What I think Steven's Outpost is sort of saying with tabletops are always going to be superior in the imagination side of things, and probably with enough work the mechanics side of things, and it's the implementation on whatever game we've got that makes that difference, and the amount of time spent and so on. You can make an okay enough story, but it's never going to be able to act on the fly like Vylentine also said. But then you've got things like AI Dungeon and neural nets that are actually coming up that on the fly, if a person had went out to put that into a game, you might get some odd things happening from time to time, but it would almost be one of the closest things you could get to a merge of tabletop and RPG in a game or narrative type setting, if a person wanted to go that free.
Procedural generation.
I mean, I've messed with AI Dungeon and things like that, and it gets predictable after a while. It's not at that level yet. It might be going towards that space, but it's nowhere
I
near.
would
So-
argue that people can be predictable after a while too. Like there's GMs who have their favorite
Sure.
monsters that they constantly
Sure. Yeah.
use and
And-
stuff. And if you want to use your knowledge as a player to counter what the GM does over and over and over again. Is it really all that different?
And
I think it is. I don't know.
See, I think if you look at so I don't like AI Dungeon actually. It's very
That was an
bland.
example of GPT-3.
Right.
Okay.
But I do like that you brought it up because it is an example. Like if you have AI Dungeon launch off dungeons, if you put in scenario and it launches you into part of game, I think that could lead into something, although it would also take fucking forever to program something like that.
You guys ever played like really old school Dungeons and
Muds?
Dragons?
Oh.
They had
Yep.
they had tables, random generated tables, and it's basically the same thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
It serves the same purpose. Like, I can't decide, let's see how, or even if I don't want to decide, let's find out. And they'd roll on the random table. And that's what AI Dungeon feels like to me, is just a glorified...
I've played with GMs like that. It's not fun to play with GMs like that.
Well,
Yeah.
I agree with Outpost. They're not adventurous. Sorry, Valentine.
No, it's actually Vylentine, but that's okay. People get it wrong all the time.
I will be right back.
I don't think anybody's arguing that computers are going to have exactly the same kind of like imagination and be able to pull from like esoteric random shit, like throwing a Lovecraftian monsters into Dungeons and Dragons if it doesn't already have that on their table. Just that it's getting closer, and that it could approximate maybe a simpler version of a D&D experience, but if you give it a scenario, like literally one of those scenarios they write up, you could have a computer run that just fine.
Yeah, absolutely. But like,
it wouldn't necessarily be any different than having a GM run it.
Sure. And role-playing games on the computer are fun. I enjoy them for what they are, but they're not the same experience. They're different. They're not, like, I'm not saying they're worse.
I don't think anybody's arguing that one is worse. Yeah,
I don't think they're worse as a game, because I love Skyrim and other RPGs like that.
I mean, Oblivion was better, but
you know what? You do you. I ain't gonna fight that fight today. But
we'll do a rematch. Don't worry.
I don't think AI Dungeon will ever get to the level of just like personalized flavor to world building, etc. I don't think it will ever just like.
It's never gonna match humans, but it can get pretty good.
Yeah. I know it can get good, but it's just like there will always be space and like I would say you could run a 5e game or like most D&D games with like AI even today, and they will not be that much different from
Hello, everyone.
What if there was a video game that ran scenarios but you could add in an optional GM to supplement the computer?
Neverwinter Nights.
Yeah, Neverwinter Nights does that. Yeah, it exists.
I know Neverwinter Nights does it, but like, is that close enough? Like, would you consider that to be?
You only have access to the assets that the program provides.
So what if it was more like Minecraft? What if it was more like Minecraft, where like you build everything?
How long? But it doesn't solve the problem of you're playing a scenario at the table, and one of your players says, "Hey, I want to do this. I want to use this ability power I have and make this effect. Can this happen in a program? Usually not. If it's not an intended interaction or effect, nothing you can do to make it have that interaction effect."
So you're saying
have the GM be allowed to make stuff happen effectively.
Okay, but I'm just saying, from a realistic perspective, how would I don't think the technology is near that yet.
So you're saying that it's
an example that I'm thinking of maybe
give me an example, please.
Like say that the player, I'm just pulling this out of my ass because I don't play D&D, but say the player has this feat to be able to jump like really, really high, and they have to get up this cliff or whatever, and they barely can't make it, but like I don't know, the wizard has a gust spell or something, and so they want to work together so that they can gust this guy up to reach the cliff top.
The greatest blowjob ever. I got it.
Right. The computer might say, what? What are you talking about? That's not possible. But what if the GM was allowed to just like literally put the player on top of the cliff?
Yeah, for that kind of thing, I think the games can already do that.
Still.
Yeah. I think that games could already do that. Cheat codes to overcome obstacles, basically, is what that is. It sounds like to me. However, for more complex
life, it's just cheat codes.
For more complex interactions, I don't think it works. I'm like, say, we'll take that scenario. The characters want to get up a cliff. None of them have a jump spell. None of them have a jump ability. None of them have a gust spell. However, one character says, "You know what? I don't want to go up that cliff. I want to go to this town and take the alternate route or try to find another way around it." And a program just doesn't have that flexibility. Yeah. Whereas you, the GM, could say, "Okay, well, tell me a little bit more about what you're trying to do here." And
I was about to say, so it sounds a bit more like the complication wouldn't come in with, say, an open world type Minecraft. Like, it would be something with a structured narrative, being able to flex the narrative as to where it would.
No, I'm talking about that too. That is a problem too. But in this case, specifically using systems and trying to make them interact with the world or the narrative in a way that is not intended by the system. A GM can't. A program can't.
I think that because of things like open world games and so on, I'm not certain that I'm confident in that assertion anymore.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a game that does this?
I'm going to keep going back to Minecraft because there is practically limitless variation within Minecraft, even with the base game.
Even any game, like there's tabletop simulators where you could just like build out the map.
So in Minecraft specifically, the sticky piston, what it does is it reaches out, it grabs a block, and it pulls it back. This is all it does. You give it a redstone signal, it does that thing. And what it's intended to do is pull a block or push a block. Again, people have used the sticky piston to create flying machines.
Could you use it to pull the moon down onto your enemy's city?
I mean, the moon doesn't exist in Minecraft, but...
That's the problem.
Well, I mean, you make a moon, then you make a moon.
It's just always on the other side of the planet.
Yeah.
What was that?
In Minecraft, the moon exists, it's just on the other side of the planet.
Well, it's just part of the skybox, really, but yeah.
I was just being sarky, sorry. No humor. Yeah. Alright, got it.
I'm not as good at picking up on people's humor.
Yeah, it's just like games, PC games just have limitations. Like, you just have to accept it. And you can't mod everything in. It's just as simple as that. And I think everyone is going to be able to agree with that.
Well, I mean, yeah, sure, but within your tabletop game, you're not going to go, I'm going to pull Jupiter down to Earth in your high fantasy...
I'm going to tell my players that, okay...
So there's limitations in your tabletop game as well. What's that?
I mean, I'm going to tell my players, okay, which deity are you addressing first about that?
No, they're going to go and do it themselves. Like, there are still limitations within your tabletop game.
No, there's limitations within the logic of the world.
Yes, and just like with video games, there is logic limitations because the moon doesn't exist in Minecraft.
Well, I mean, even if, say, they wanted to do that theoretically, what's the problem with saying that happens and then on, like, in the game world, creating the effects of what happens after? Even if you can't visually represent them, like, pulling down the moon, assuming you would allow it at your table, because that seems kind of ridiculous to me, but assuming it's allowed, assuming it works within the confines of the game, narratively, you could just create a fucking, like, destroy the town, create a crater, and say it happened. I mean, we do that shit at the table. It's all verbal at the table.
You know what?
The problem is it doesn't always have to be. We think of video games as automatically visually representing whatever's happening, but it can just happen off screen, and we can say it happened and then try our best to simulate the effects thereof, because that's what we can do within the game.
Let me say this: you can do everything in a tabletop game, but you shouldn't do everything in a tabletop game.
True.
Exactly. So that's the point I'm making, is that it's not about whether you can do everything, but you shouldn't, because it would kill the logic of the world.
Right, but my entire point is, just because it's a video game doesn't inherently mean that it's less possible to happen. You just have to work within the confines of the media you're using.
I would love
just like you do in a tabletop.
I would love for a program to give someone that much flexibility to do what you are talking about. I just don't know of any program that does so. And
I mean, there's tabletop simulators.
Yeah, but I've used those, and you can't. Like a tabletop simulator, you usually used to play a tabletop game with, and it's simply a visual representation rather than an actual system of a game.
Right, and you're talking.
But
there are virtual tabletops out there.
So, I think a better example.
I'm comparing a video game with the way it visually represents and then also mechanically represents, because the video game's both of those things in one, right? Typically. I'm likening that to using D&D with maps and figures. That's the visual representation part. The visual representation part of D&D with the maps and the figures also have a lot of limitations. If you're trying to pull the moon down onto a town, you're not usually gonna have a moon figure.
Yeah,
but you can clear all the houses and stuff and say there's a crater there.
That's one of the downsides of using a virtual tabletop. Virtual tabletops have a lot of advantages in that they allow people to play from disparate places all together at the same time. It's awesome. But they have limitations that will restrict you in a way that playing face to face does not.
But if you still have
that one.
Okay, go ahead.
With a lot of tabletop representations, what's the difference between having a table and a limited number of figures?
Well, for example, if you are face to face, usually the reliance isn't on figures. At least for me, it isn't on figures. It isn't on visual props. It's theater of the mind.
So that brings me into what I think one of the key differences between Magic in tabletop games and video games is how things are represented. Not necessarily the quality between tabletop and a video game, because you're never going to get that branch to meet in the middle. The power of a person's imagination versus what the computer spits out is never going to balance. But with, for example, using a tabletop tool, unless you're using one that's a limited one and it's just showing, say, counters, I don't see that different to being on a tabletop, and it just allows people from different parts of the world to play. I do get what you're meaning, that when you're in person to each other, there's a lot more openness. But what I was going to segue into was tabletop stuff. It has its benefits of being able to be very malleable. You can change the game rules. You can change how the magic rules, even if you've got them written down. Just because they're written down, you can change them on the fly. They can all of a sudden. Magic's been sucked out of the world. The game would have to be programmed to do that. Whereas in a computer game, its advantages are visualization, like Vylentine was saying, visualization, audio. For example, if you're playing tabletop and you want to show color spray, are you going to get some hundreds and thousands out from the kitchen and sprinkle them on the little figures? Possibly.
Glitter!
Glitter is a thing. It happens.
Oh, no.
Oh my god, that'd be...
It depends on what you feel like is more important for your game. Video games having the visual representation, especially with virtual tabletop spaces, usually it's going to be a lot cheaper to buy all those, to have, because the game comes with a certain amount of figures and terrain and stuff. Yeah, those things cost hundreds of dollars for physical copies.
Know, right?
I know, they're way too expensive. And then you have to put them together and paint them? No, sir, I'm not paying $100 for a figure that I have to put together and paint myself. Fuck that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, tangent.
Hey there,
what walking into.
It comes with all these pieces, and
this is an awesome thing. Look at it. I painted it. I put it together.
I don't
it's
have
really
patience,
cool.
and if I'm paying $100 for a figure, I want it already painted and put together for me.
Amen.
That's part of the $100 as far as I'm concerned.
Hey there, Wordy. You're just walking into the middle of a heated D&D conversation. Well,
Nice.
TTRPG.
Tabletop, I don't think is inherently, or is really any different than a physical tabletop. It's a lot easier to get into. Like, the price is easier. It comes with a lot more right off the bat. And there, I just genuinely don't think there's really anything all that different from a virtual tabletop with a GM versus a physical one, like in person.
So
it's still very reliant on theater of the mind. It's still very, and like, if you have all these toggles and switches that you can play with, if they build those in, it can be very, very flexible, but they have to be built in. You're right.
You talk about flaws in magic systems. That's actually quite a good point. That like, I know flaws in a character are great. They're a great hook for DMs and so on, or GMs, or whatever you call them, in that community. But in Magic, for example, if you're doing, say, a Call of Cthulhu one, the more you use magic, or the more you know about magic, the more insane you go, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think talking about in video games, or in tabletop games, Mage the Awakening with its paradox system is really, really good, because as you cast spells during a scene, it does the Shadowrun thing that Whick was talking about earlier, where like the risk builds and builds and builds until inevitably you pull something out of somewhere where it's not supposed to be. And then as far as video games go, actually, Thaumcraft, the mod I've been playing recently,
here it comes again.
has a really good pollution mechanic, where as you're accidentally not using your magic, you go and you release the magic into the world, and you don't use it, it slowly tears the world apart.
I like defilers and protectors. I can't remember in D&D. They would either drain magic from around them, or the preservers. That's the one. They would cast magic and borrow from around them. So there were two aspects. But again, they have negatives and positives. For example, the preserver, if they were in a desert, they couldn't cast because there was nothing around them to drain from. Whereas a despoiler, what the fuck, I've changed it again. The bad guys, so to speak, they would just literally turn the sand to glass all around them to cast their spells. So these are all emergent effects of magic systems, regardless of where they are. Whereas I'd like to say that in tabletop, we've got a lot of control over that. Whereas how do you represent, for example, insanity in a video game? Does your eyesight go blurry? Do you start seeing things? They're all things that have to be coded in and accounted for. So it's a little bit more difficult where magic systems.
I actually personally find most tabletop systems that deal with like there being some kind of drawback to magic or some kind of penalty for using it tends to be one of the more gamified aspects as opposed to the narrative aspects.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about spell slots. When you run out of spell slots, theoretically, you'd feel like the character would feel drained or like theoretically, obviously. The character might feel drained or tired or maybe a little empty, like maybe, but it's never like actually codified in the narrative as far as I know. And so people just be like, oh, well, I'm out of spell slots and you can't do magic and there's no other effects.
Okay, but can I jump in here real quick? But I like that there is no rules for that. And I'll tell you why. Because it allows the table to make those rules without any pushback from the system. No one's going to be like, actually, it says in page 245 that you don't feel drained, you feel fatigued, which is different. You know what I mean? Like you don't.
But I think
like it ends up with people wholly ignoring that there might be a side effect to being out of spell slots.
Yeah, but hold on. No, the system is put. Like, everything is a them problem. Swinging your sword is a them problem until it tells you to roll a d20. Like,
I'm having deja vu right now.
Yes, this is literally the argument.
This is literally every. So
like,
this is every disagreement me and Whick have.
Is great, but a good GM is great, and a good GM can cover up a lot of the weaknesses of a system. But that doesn't mean the weakness isn't there in the system.
Yeah,
I'm just saying, I'd rather have freedom from than.
Maybe the system should be like, hey, GM, make sure there's some kind of narrative piece to this without
what
necessarily
if the system
giving a
does it
narrative beat.
shitty? Then it's hard to get rid of it.
No, that's what I'm saying is what if the system was just like, hey, as a GM, maybe like as a little tooltip in the corner, be like, hey, when your players' characters are out of spell slots, make sure that they think about how that might affect them as a character. D&D, in my point of view, is really, really bad about tying mechanics to narrative.
I think that one of the
in my view. So I feel like they feel very separate, and that's one of my biggest gripes. Is I want them to come together to.
I'm not gonna argue with on that.
And a good GM does that, but a mediocre to bad GM is just going to ignore it because it's not part of the system.
Okay,
I
agree.
And basically, the idea is
weep. I'm bad GM.
Overall, it's like, sure, you can cover up the flaws of the system. Like, if I want to go straight as like communist talking points here, it's like, for example, like you can have people be financially successful within capitalism. Capitalism fundamentally just says no to that.
I'm gonna dodge that bullet.
Yeah, we're not going into politics on this one.
We're not gonna go into that. Hey. But I will say that as having DM'd and run games for so long, that the flaws of a system for a mediocre to an easy GM, or not easy, but a beginner GM, is not something I take into account when I'm choosing a system for my table. Because
for your table, because you're DMing it.
But isn't that what it all is? It's about my table in the end. Well,
but the issue is we're trying to apply general practices.
We're discussing the systems.
Okay.
So I'm criticizing
we're trying to apply general trends, and in the reality is like the anecdotes may have some relevance, but in reality, anecdotes are going to only have such a significant amount of relevance.
Mind you, video games also obviously gamify magic, and that you run out of mana, and then like you just can't cast spells until it comes back. I think that's a problem. I think it would be neat if like I heard my character like gasping for breath like they do when they run out of their sprint bar.
I think
or like look like feel like
I think there are some pretty cool magic systems out there where like in some games I'm gonna go back to Rimworld real quick, but there's a mod for Rimworld where your character, it's like the cult mod where your colony can cast spells and it literally drains their sanity to do so. They're like two separate sanity bars in Rimworld, so like...
I don't know Rimworld that well, unfortunately.
I know World Rim.
World... I'm just thinking of other things with rimming, but if
oh my god!
Yeah,
I'm glad somebody did.
We are devolving so much.
Okay. But my point here is that
wait, there's a mod for that too.
We gotta recognize that in all instances we are using games to tell a story, and so there are going to be gamist elements, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I'm not arguing against the gamist elements per se. I'm arguing against the gamist elements that don't then also have some kind of narrative tie-in or in-world effect.
But should we make that? Okay, should
if
we
I'm
make
out of spell slots, we can all agree that that should have some kind of effect in the game, right? On your character narratively. Can we
yes.
that?
Yeah.
Sure,
like
yes.
It doesn't even necessarily have to be
the cult
mechanically
mod. It was really good.
As a whole separate thing because it's already represented by being out of spell slots. But narratively, it would be helpful. Like it would. I don't know. Maybe it's because I get so into the narrative side of it, and I really I start to act like the character. Like I really embody the character's headspace. The fact that like we just kind of ignore it, like it's not a big deal, seems like an issue to me. I would rather have the game like suggest that like. Maybe your character feels tired or a little run down, or maybe colors don't look as bright. Like just something to make me feel the world a little more. Or
you want a blurb to give you inspiration on how to roleplay. I don't.
Right. I want to know how the characters feel in the world.
I don't want. This is a.
No, but you see. Sorry. Wait.
Can I finish real quick?
Yeah.
Again, narrative rules for the rules for the narrative and the role playing, I tend to not want, because it gets in the way of my role playing and the players at my table. If the rules get in the way, I don't like it. I need the rules for combat. I need the rules for niche situations like that. Otherwise, don't give me rules. Let me fly. Let me fly free, baby. Let me fly free.
But you see, the issue is, she's not saying that the rules determine how she acts. They're more of an inspiration and a guiding point.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, like we were talking about the LARPing situation, and we were talking about how all of these different like mind-altering effects that produce like different behavioral outcomes. What happens is, in that instance, is it's not going to determine exactly how you're going to act, but it's going to give a general inspiration and general direction for your character and person to move through. So the issue, I just wanted to clarify her point there, because I felt like there was a confusion there.
Okay, I mean, I get it. I get that she wants that inspiration, but like I said, I find that, again, in practice, it generally, and again, maybe this is just my experience, but it lends to someone saying, well, no, that's not how you feel, because the rules specifically state...
because I don't deal with rules.
Sure, I understand. Yeah. But again, this is personal experience. You know, we're going back to personal lived experience. I've had people tell me that before, that, well, no, the rules specifically state that you don't feel that way. And I'm like, man, just let me role play with my good idea.
Okay.
Do you want to like do like 1 minute wrap ups to do our socials and
Yep.
whatnot?
I was about to hand it over to you because you're directly next to me, and then we'll go down to Whick, then Wordy, then I'll see if Apnea's woken up.
Okay. Hi again. I am Vylentine. I have an 18+ Twitter, which is at Vylentine. 18+. I mean it. I'm a nerdy. I'm witchy. I like politics. I like vampires a lot. Probably too much. And I do 18+ things on the internet to earn money. So that's me.
Oh, my turn?
Yep.
I guess. Okay. Jason, Whick, I don't have a stream or social media as such, but I'm looking to start something. But if you're interested in me, you can get a hold of me on Discord. Whick number 8268. Feel free to DM me with any ideas you have, or you know, it's not 18+, but I would prefer 18+, because it'd be really weird if you can't DM me. Just, we're not gonna do it anyway. But yeah, politics, games, stories. I'm a storyteller by heart. I love to tell stories, so if you want to engage in that, cool.
Okay, so my name's Wordy. I'm dropping my Twitch in the chat. Basically, I'm an up-and-coming newbie streamer. I have a shitty computer, so I can only play so well games, like a lot of indie games, basically. But discuss about politics, play a lot of video games, have a lot of debates. Like, I've got a debate coming up with American Nacho on Tuesday. We're going to be talking about decommodified healthcare. So I think, like, you know, that's pretty interesting to talk about itself. You know, I'm a anarcho-communist and gender anarchist. So, you know, that's how it goes. You know, make sure you to follow me on my YouTube channel. Like, I've got all my connections on my Twitch page. So, you know, just check it out. Come in, hang out, you know, watch me play some video games. I'll play Vampire the Masquerade on Saturday and Sunday for Bloodline, so yeah.
Hey, Darth, you awake over there?
Yeah, apparently something was going wrong with my mic. I was wondering why you guys kept talking over me.
Yeah, so before you shot yourself out, what did you think of the panel in particular, as like the software engineer person?
Well, yeah, so I was coming into this, I was thinking you guys would focus more on the mechanics side of things of the Magic systems and the differences between TT and video games. But the conversation went in some really nice ways where it went into repercussions of how role-playing games in and of themselves are shown on tabletop and video games. As in tabletop, you've got a lot of back and forth between your DM and your players, and there's a lot of feedback given or taken, and it's down to the individual people, where in a video game, that control is almost taken away from you, but it also gives you a little bit more expression in certain stuff. So what I really liked with this panel that I was listening to and talking to you guys is there's a lot of ideas that I really want to steal for a start.
Hey, any ideas that I have, feel free to use. Minor crediting, maybe. But anyone else's ideas, of course, consult them first.
Don't take my book idea. I'm writing it. I'm writing it.
Well, actually, I had something I wanted to say to you before I did my 1 minute shtick, by the way, Vylentine. Was you were talking about the magic that's music. Is that right?
I mean, I've definitely had ideas about musical magic stuff, but I don't think I actually said.
Polymath. She's actually writing a RPG, not an RPG, sort of more of one of those storybook sort of ones, and the key people in it, they in one part they do music through magic through voice and commands, and
I was talking about my character who was a pop star. Yeah, sorry.
But it reminded me of what she's actually writing this main app that she's doing, the game app. And it was a magic system where the person could detect lies. And it goes into the fact where just because a person's lying, and you know they're lying, you don't know why. And that's, again, mechanics, narrative, and system all combining into one. So this conversation, you were asking me about the panels, Mr. No Bubbles, but you guys have all shared
Why does everybody say Mr. No Bubbles?
Aspects of how systems, different magic things, and different approaches that you guys will take.
Why do so many people call me Mr. No Bubbles? That's so weird.
Letting me be here.
Yep, and go ahead and shout yourself out.
Okay, well, I play a lot of games. Tends to be almost anything from high tech to role playing. I play Rimworld like Mr. Nobody's. But the focus of my panel, my Twitch, is to play these games in some sort of modded way or have an external application that I've designed that'll change the gameplay in some way. So that's sort of the crux of it. At the moment, I haven't been doing much of it because there's a lot of games that are really, really fun to play just vanilla.
Right. Yeah, I saw you playing some Dyson Sphere and so on. Hey there, everyone. So if you're interested in participating in one of these conversations about magic in video games, tabletop RPGs, movies, books, fantasy in general, live action roleplay, anything like that, make sure to hit me up in the comments down below. I'm very interested in having these conversations and continuing them. I try to stream 3 nights a week. Every so often I'll have somebody on to have these conversations, and I would be very interested in including you in them. Also, if you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe, and all of that stuff. In the meantime, though, just remember, nobody cares. Thank you all very much, and good night.